Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano, and Happy New Year. It's 2023, and there's little doubt it's been a rough couple of years. I mean, we can't argue that. When we look at how rapidly everything has changed, it's stunning, and it happened quickly, that's for sure. We've seen this drip, drip, drip over the last 20 years, but over the course of the last 3 years, we've seen the floodgates opened. Unfortunately, they're staying open as of right now. And this year, I want to raise the fundamental question of how we restore the United States and return sanity back to the political system. Rid the system of this political corruption that we have witnessed over the last couple of decades. How we begin to solve the problems using reason and logic instead of emotion. How do we stop this socialist Marxist push from encroaching on every aspect of our lives? And I can think of no better guest to bring on than an intellectual giant. Dr. Victor Davis Hanson returns to the P.A.S. Report podcast. He wrote the best-selling book, The Dying Citizen, and I want to talk to him about how our politicians have abandoned the people they have sworn to serve. I want to talk to him about the collapse of the southern border and what it means for America and Americans over the long term. I want to talk to him about the corruption within the bureaucracy and how many of our agencies have been politically weaponized. But most importantly, I want to explore how we right the ship, how we begin to return to the principles that led the United States to become the sole superpower and the greatest nation in the history of the world. Now, before I bring on Dr. Hanson, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you find the show informative, please share it with your family and friends. Don't forget to visit the PAS Report website, pasreport.com. Sign up for the newsletter. And with that out of the way, I want to welcome Dr. Victor Davis Hanson to the PAS Report, author of The Dying Citizen, a book that has so much relevancy today, and I encourage everyone to read it. Dr. Hanson, welcome to the PAS Report. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you.
Well, as far as what we're witnessing in the United States, we see this unending flow of migration coming into the United States. You see the Biden administration completely doesn't care about the border. They just opened it up. Title 42, while the Supreme Court has said it's going to stay intact for now, the reality is it was a disaster even without Title 22. With or without it, we have a problem. Can you explain to the audience what's going on with the border?
Well, I think the Biden administration believes that it has a brief window of 4 years, and it can be less than transparent and obfuscate, distract, and in the meantime, maybe get anywhere from 3 to 6 million illegal aliens into the United States. That would be 4, 5, 6 major cities. And they're not going to stop. And they're going to say it's the border secure, or that people are racist, or when they say demography is destiny and anybody says, yeah, it is, they say you believe in the great replacement theory and you're racist. So they're not going to finish the wall. They're not going to be able to mile of it. They're not going to stop the catch and release. They're not going to pressure Mexico or Central America. They're not going to say anything about sanctuary cities or refugee status or deportation, none of that, because this is what they want. What we see is a disaster. Every night, they're going to deny. And unfortunately, they think the midterms was a booster or fuel for their position because they felt that either it was not an issue that was of concern or people support them, even though we know that's not true from the polls. So they're going to keep doing this until they lose the Senate and the administration.
Speaking on denial, they keep going with the number that there's 12 million illegal immigrants in the United States. They've been using that number since 2005. Now, MIT did a study. They projected more at 25 to 35 million, and that was pre-Biden administration. So God only knows what it's now. But one of the big problems when you have this level of migration is assimilation. That assimilation does not take place. Can you explain to the audience how the lack of assimilation is ultimately going to redefine the United States and the culture of the United States?
Well, the tenets of the melting pot were that in addition to legal immigration that had some kind of meritocratic audit and was limited in some way and expected something of the immigrant, there was the cultural aspect, informal, of the melting pot. And that was the principle, was that if you come from a different country with that particular cultural cargo with you, you've already made a decision that you want to shed some of it and all of it and come and become an American. And we always said, if you want to keep your food or your fashion or your music or your art, that enriches the country. Everybody has this ethnic fides that they're proud of, but we don't tamper with the main menu of Americanism: consensual government, individual liberty, the Constitution, free market capitalism, because those are the tenets that make us prosperous and attractive. But when you go to the salad bowl and you say to somebody in just take one example, southern Mexico, from Oaxaca, and saying, when you come up here, you're entering a racist, homophobic, misogynist, xenophobic, toxic place, and we have a lot to atone for, and you have claims against the host as a victim almost immediately, and your children or you will be subject to affirmative action, and the law will be exempt. You won't have to worry about violating as your first act the immigration law. Your second act is residing illegally in this country. Probably your third act of having some type of unlawful ID. And that message goes out to the immigrant that if I come up and say in southern Mexico, we throw the trash out the window, I can do it here in the United States. If I come from another country where we all have various IDs, that's no big thing. And if you hire your cousin or somebody who looks like you rather than on a meritocratic basis, that's fine too. So when you get that number of people and you're not assimilating or integrating or intermarrying them, and they're these enclaves, and we learned this in the 19th century when we were much more confident of our own powers of assimilation. But when you do this, then you have these unassimilated blocks, and the country then accommodates people who broke the law, and you reach a critical mass where the system doesn't work. And I think California is pretty much an example of what happens. It's got 40 or 50% of the illegal aliens the last 40 years. When you have 27% of the country, of the state residents were not born in the United States and they're not being assimilated, then that can affect everything from driving a car and seeing people who don't know that the basic traffic laws, or going into a government office and waiting an hour while there's a myriad of languages because nobody feels it's incumbent to learn English, or having vast amounts of black market economy where people feel that they're exempt from paying sales tax. So we have these huge swap meets, marts everywhere where I live, and people from different countries simply buy and sell there exclusively, and they never pay sales tax. Or zoning laws are not applicable. If you go up and down California, you'll see people with 3 or 4 families living in Winnebago's trailers out in front of their house in the garage. And the idea is that they perceive they're a victim, and that nobody from the county will come and say you're in violation of the law.
And I want to piggyback off that, because let's face it, I mean, resources are limited. Money is limited. And when you have migrants coming in, especially with the numbers that we're talking about, illegal immigrants coming in, it costs a lot of money. These people aren't coming in with tens of thousands of dollars in a bank account where they could sustain themselves. So they're utilizing services that are meant for American citizens. And I think that, part of understanding the dying citizen, when did the politicians of the United States actually give up on the American people? Because that's the way a lot of people feel.
Well, if you go back to the 1992 Democratic Convention or the 96 Convention, Bill and Hillary Clinton, as part of his nominating and re-election later, 4 years later, speeches, they would have been drummed out of the Democratic Party for what they said today.
They've been like hardcore conservatives.
Yes, they were. They said, what is it about you don't understand about illegal? And this immigration shorts legal immigrants who are waiting patient in line. It destroys unionization. It erodes the wages of the backbone of the Democratic Party, working class people. And they were railing against corporate America that was trying to get cheap labor. But that was at a time, probably 30 years ago, when there was maybe 8 or 9 million illegal aliens. But when you've got 30 million and you have 50 million that were not born, and the other 20 are probably of various legal statuses, either newly acquired people who've newly acquired citizenship or legal residents, or they're just here visiting and they've overstayed. But we have 50 million people in terms of percent, maybe 13, 14% of the population. And then in numbers, it's an all-time high. And you're not assimilating them. So then the Democratic Party reacts to that reality. And they say these 50 million people are going to have children, and maybe they're going to have 100 million very soon. And this is a constituency that will be receptive to a message that otherwise is not resonating with people, the left-wing neo-socialist message. And that's how and then they're going to bundle it all on this idea that demography is destiny. And they keep writing books with that title. And then the moment a conservative or traditionalist or a centrist says, yes, we agree with you, demography is destiny. And unlike you, we agree that it exists. We agree that's what you're doing, but it's destroying the country. Then they say, oh, you're racist. You believe in the great replacement theory. And so we know what they're doing. They flip California. They flip New Mexico. They flipped Colorado. They probably flipped Nevada. They're working on Arizona, Georgia, and of course, Texas. And the only mystery about it all is it does seem that after 2 to 3 generations, Mexican and Central American immigrants start to emulate the Italian-American experience of the 19th century. They came from impoverished areas. They came in a monolithic fashion. They were Catholic. And then today, if I say your name is Giuliani or Cuomo, you can't distinguish what their political affiliation is. And so that is starting to happen now in the 3rd generation, and it's terrifying the Democrats. If the Republicans could shut the border down and not have that infusion of just abject poor people who need health and education and housing and food subsidies, I think you could have the early second generation start to vote conservative as well. And at that point, the Democrats would shut the border down because they would be, as they do with Cubans. Every time there's a wave mentioned of immigrants from Cuba, they don't want them. In fact, they'd say, you don't have a visa, go back. They have a little bit of that feeling also with Venezuelan because they feel that they're fleeing communism. But that's the only hope I see, unless the Republicans can take both houses and the presidency and finish the wall and go back and follow the Trump agenda, get rid of Trump catch and release, tell the Mexican government that if they don't stop it, we're going to tax the remittances, 60 billion to Central America and Mexico. If we did 10%, $6 billion, and we should just add insult to injury and say we're going to build a wall with that tax revenue, I think they'd stop very quickly.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. And when we get back, I want to ask you about the corruption within the federal bureaucracy, how agencies have abdicated their responsibility, how they've been politically weaponized. So we'll be right back after this break. The Department of Homeland Security has abdicated its responsibility, but we've also seen other agencies and departments become ideologically weaponized for political purposes. And it actually started a while ago where you had the NSA spying, IRS, targeting Tea Party groups. You had the CIA spying on sitting members of the United States Senate. But now the FBI, I mean, it seems that the entire agency is toxic, that they collude with social media, that they want to be in charge of messaging and determining the flow of information out there. How concerned are you with the revelations from the Twitter files and what the FBI has done over the last 10 years?
I'm very concerned. I think it's the greatest transformation, not only in the actual behavior of the FBI, but in the transformation of traditional support for the FBI. Because I can tell you, traveling quite a bit, doing a lot of media and getting personal correspondence, I would say the number of conservatives right now that support the FBI or the senior leadership in the Pentagon or the CIA is almost zero. It's that radical. And that's because of the activity of the last 10 years. Specifically, the FBI tried to warp an entire election in 2016. It intervened with a Steele dossier who was being paid as a foreign national to participate in the on the DNC's efforts to elect Hillary Clinton. But I guess the question was, as we learned is there anything that FBI would not do? By that, I mean, they forged an affidavit for a FISA court. They wiped clean subpoenaed data for phones of the Mueller investigation, FBI agents. We know what Peter Strzok and Lisa Page were fired, and then that firing was hidden for a long time because of their prejudice as independent supposed litigators and investigators. And then we look at the last four directors. Mueller testified under oath that he didn't know what the Steele dossier was, or who Christopher Steele was, or Fusion GPS, which were the pillars of his investigation. And the next one, Comey, said 245 times under oath he couldn't remember. And then remember, he assured the president in a private conversation he wasn't under investigation while he went out and memorialized the conversation, then leaked it to the New York Times. And then we had Andrew McCabe, who by his own admission confessed to lying 4 times to federal investigators. And then we had Christopher Wray, who, he just said while under oath to Senator Grassley that he couldn't stay very much longer and answer any question. He had an appointment. He got on the FBI jet and flew to his Adirondack vacation home. And of course, he had done these performance art arrests of Peter Navarro or John Eastman, the Mar-a-Lago raid, the spying on the students. So you add all of that together, that was all pre-Twitter. And then you say, well, the FBI has vastly exceeded its purview. And then you see that Twitter was like a defense contractor. In other words, there was this welding between FBI agents who were communicating with Twitter and ordering them how to censor news that would favor the Biden campaign in an election cycle. And then with the understanding that there was going to be a nice billet upon retirement for a lot of high ranking, like James Baker, the attorney. And this is even more disturbing because we don't have any information yet about Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. We know that he put $419 million, as Molly Ball told us in a Time magazine article, into the election. We know that Google has been caught adjusting the order of its Google searches for political purposes. And the FBI seems to be either aware of all this and doesn't do anything, or it's an active participant. So I think most people on the conservative side would like it to be broken up and its bureaus farmed out to other agencies, maybe at least have it taken out of Washington. But I don't think it could continue under its current auspice. It's too dangerous. When you interfere in a U.S. election, and you do that twice, and you are using private contractors to censor free expression and contrary to the Constitution, in some sense, you violated the Constitution by using these private contractors and then threatening them. I don't think there's anything that they won't consider, they won't do. And when you look at the directors, they've either lied or pled amnesia when they've been questioned. And there's no way Christopher Wray will sit down and explain the Mar-a-Lago raid or why he's arresting these former Trump people in the way he's arresting them, or why they're undercover at school boards. So he's defiant. He knows he's going to be fired the moment Biden leaves the White House. He knows that. And so I think their attitude is, after me, the deluge. They're just going to accelerate what they're doing with the idea they can make fundamental change before they're held accountable.
And a final question, because when it comes to history, you're an intellectual giant. Do you think that this is America's decline, that it's going to continue to get worse and worse, that we'll continue to get more authoritarian and the government will grow further and further corrupt and more abusive? Or do you think that there's going to be a course correction at some point, that we could begin to turn things around? What do you think?
There's going to be a course correction. There's no doubt about it, because most of the polls on the issues that we've been discussing favor a traditional American point. Most people want the border closed. Most people are worried about $31 trillion in debt. Most people feel the voting system has been revolutionized to their detriment. It doesn't work the way it does. Most people prefer that race be incidental, not essential to who they are. There's no support for affirmative action. As I said, there's no support for an open border. But the question is that the institutions that mold public opinion in an electronic age with this new technology that traditionalists and Republicans don't seem to have the same expertise in. And so when you lose the corporate boardroom and Wall Street and K through 12 and academia and professional sports and Hollywood and Silicon Valley and print media, they have such huge resources at molding public opinion and punishing people, especially the permanent administrative state. So historically, I mean, if you look at the Roman Empire, you could argue that by 40 AD, people thought it was over with. There was no way they were going to survive the Principate. And maybe by 80 AD, they thought, how can you survive Caligula or Nero and Galba and Otho all in 1 year? But they did. And then they had the Vespasian and then era, and then they had the 5 good emperors. But each time they had a cycle of reform, there was less vibrance. They were always trying to get back to where they had been rather than to advance beyond that. So that's what it's worrisome. And our problem right now is we have so much ignorance in the country. We have a whole shadow population of 200 million people who, if you say to them, it's Thanksgiving, you know what that is? You know who Abraham Lincoln was? You know what the Battle of Gettysburg, what was D-Day? They have no idea. And they're completely ignorant of it. And the Democratic Party wants them that way. So I think there will be a correction. It's just a question, do people have the fortitude and the energy to go back, not to where we were in 2010, which was bad, but go back to where we were prior to 1995, maybe go back to the 80s or something. I think we can do it. But when you have all the institutions, you can compromise people. So when you get a Republican senator, for example, and he knows if he writes a memoir, they'll trash it, maybe, but maybe not if he kind of fudges a little bit. The New York Times may adopt him, or he can go on a Sunday talk show on CBS, or his son can be hired, as Anthony Fauci's daughter was at Twitter, or he can get if he's he's a high-ranking general, he can get a job with a defense contractor when he retired. There are so many enticements that most people get compromised on the right. When you have people that are they want a radical change, they get destroyed by the system. So people who are very vocal, like a Donald Trump or Josh Hawley or Rand Paul or Ted Cruz, it almost absorbs them. They get attacked in so many different ways, and people don't take them seriously. Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, the Republican Party has been basically a party of Mitt Romney and John McCain, that type of, or Jeb Bush. And, these are nice people, but they feel that they've been so fortunate in life and they're so insulated, they and their families, from the detriment that's around them, that it's kind of like, well, yeah, that country's going to hell, but it's pretty good for me. And, it's your problem, not mine.
Yeah, we certainly need more Senator Rand Pauls, people with integrity that stand by principles. That would help a lot, that's for sure. Dr. Hanson, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on to speak to the audience. And just so you know, the fear about the American education system, all my students fail the citizenship test every semester. Just about 98% of them will fail the citizenship exam. And it tells you what an abysmal state we're in right now.
It does. Well, thank you for having me.
Whenever I listen to Dr. Hanson, I always learn so much. And make sure to follow him. I have the links up at the P.A.S. Report. Check out his book, The Dying Citizen, How Progressive Elites, Tribalism, and Globalization Are Destroying the Idea of America. And as always, please share this episode with family, friends, and on social media. If you find the podcast informative, please give the P.A.S. Report a 5-star rating, write a review on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Audible, or anywhere they allow reviews. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back on Wednesday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.